Yeah, our next speaker is Julisa Fernandez-Rivera from University of Texas, and her speech, the title of her speech is Non-Agential Collectives, Collective Responsibility, and the Moral Address Condition. So the floor is yours, Julisa.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I just real quick want to pull up my PowerPoint, share with everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay,
We
great.
do.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So I want to first thank the organizers for putting this conference together. I am so happy to be here. I really appreciate all the work that goes into putting a conference together. I know how much work that is. So my paper is Non-Agential Collectives, Collective Responsibility, and the Moral Address Condition. And I want to preface by saying that I got into this field of study because in the United States, I was interested in ethno-racial collectives and the relationship and collective responsibility going on currently in the United States between the Black collective, the White collective, and Latinx collectives. And when I wanted to read up more about what it means to say that maybe one ethno-racial collective has a moral responsibility towards another ethno-racial collective, I couldn't really find what I was looking for in the literature on collective agency and collective responsibility. So I decided to do some research on this. And I also apologize if I speak too fast. It's a really bad habit I'm trying to cut. So anyway, let's continue. So my thesis is that certain non-agential collectives in specific situations can be bearers of collective responsibility by being the appropriate subjects of reactive attitudes. So the way in which I intend to do this is by exploring how a non-agential collective can meet Strawson's account of reactive attitudes and the moral address condition. So I will briefly discuss Strawson's account of participant reactive attitudes and responsibility. Then I'm going to be discussing how Deborah Tollefson and Kay Matheson have extended Strawson's account of reactive attitudes onto collectives and collective responsibility. And from there, I'm going to be discussing Strawson's account of the moral address condition and what I call the big deal. So why it is so many collective action theorists and collective action responsibility theorists are addressing collective responsibility in the way that they are. And lastly, I'm going to be discussing my solution as to how certain non-agential collectives can meet the moral address condition, be subjects of reactive attitudes, and hence the bearers of collective responsibility. And I do this by exploring and discussing a case by Virginia Held and by discussing what her case entails. So, Strawson's account of reactive attitudes. In the debate over free will and moral responsibility, Strawson's account of participant reactive attitudes offers a version of compatibilism. So according to Strawson, even if the determinist thesis were true, even if all behavior was determined, we could still hold others and ourselves morally responsible. His approach and analysis of moral responsibility does not require that he solve the debate or the metaphysical issue of determinism. Excuse me. Rather, he claims we care about and take into consideration whether someone's attitudes or actions towards us are of goodwill, affection, indifference, malevolence, and so on and so forth. On Strawson's account, we do not need an external justification for moral responsibility. Instead, his idea as to what grounds moral responsibility are participant reactive attitudes. Thus, to be held morally responsible is to be the appropriate target of a reactive attitude. So I then wanted to see how collective action theorists are using Strawson's approach, and I really like how Tollefson and Matheson are doing this. So for Tollefson, she's going to argue that certain kinds of collectives have been and can be the targets of these reactive attitudes. And the kind of collectives that are the appropriate targets are the ones that are able to meet her normative competence condition. That is, the collective must have the capacity to understand moral demands, guide its behavior and attitudes as a result of the moral demands, and they must have the capacity to deliberate. So one example she goes into is the tobacco industry, or what I call the tobacco industry case. So in 1953, the tobacco industry released an advertisement falsely stating there was no connection between cigarette smoking and cancer. And following the release of the advertisement, the industry invested in a decades-long campaign to deceive the public about the dangers of cigarette smoking. This deception has led to certain reactive attitudes towards tobacco companies from the public, such as anger, resentment, and indignation. So according to Tollefson's accounts, the tobacco industry would meet her normative competence condition by being able to make decisions, deliberate, and come to the conclusion to lie to the public. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the tobacco industry is the proper target of reactive attitudes, so like anger and resentment. But that also means then that we can hold the tobacco industry morally blameworthy and hold them responsible for lying to the public. And I find that interesting on its own because the tobacco industry would be held morally accountable in a non-distributive way. So we will hold the industry itself responsible, not each individual incorporated in the industry, but that's for another talk. Next is how Matheson uses Strawson. So she argues that certain collectives can qualify as moral agents, and she does this through a Strawsonian approach. So Matheson develops a criterion for moral agency by examining society's practice of holding individuals morally responsible. And she argues the criteria for an individual to be a moral agent is applicable towards collectives. So she gives us three main conditions of moral agency: perspective, a capacity for second-order reflection, and sensitivity to moral reasons. So to have a perspective means one has a framework of beliefs, desires, and goals. By having a perspective, an individual is able to respond to their environment, they're able to reason, make choices, and form intentions. Second-order reflection is to evaluate your intentions, beliefs, and desires. And you should be able to reflect on and decide if you want to continue endorsing your current intentions, beliefs, and desires. Lastly, sensitivity to moral reasons is a moral agent must be able to morally reason and respond to moral reasons. Okay. So Matheson provides a step-by-step theory of how a collective has to function and how a collective has to be structured in order to be parallel to an individual moral agent. And we can see this with the tobacco industry case as well. We can see that maybe for the tobacco industry, their perspective was to have the intention to deceive the public. Their second-order reflection was, even if they evaluate their intention to deceive the public, they decide they still want to hold on to that intention because they funded decades-long campaigns deceiving the public. And lastly, sensitivity to moral reasons. Well, even though you would think the tobacco industry knew what they were doing was wrong, they didn't seem to care. They still lied to the public regardless. So why am I looking at all of this? Why am I looking at Tollefson and Matheson? Well, their research only allows us to look at collectives that fall under the collective agent category. That is, collectives that can form intentions, make decisions, and pursue a goal. So such as governments, clubs, sports teams, educational institutions, and so on, are what are primarily being looked at. And if you recall what I said in the beginning, I'm interested in collectives that do not fall under the collective agency category. I'm interested in collectives that can't form intentions or beliefs or goals, or at least currently can't form intentions, beliefs, or goals. So then this leads to certain cases regarding non-agential collectives to be overlooked or altogether ignored. And cases where we may hold negative or positive reactive attitude towards non-agential collectives are claimed to be misdirected and misplaced of one's reactive attitudes. So I was interested in figuring out why this was the case. Why is this occurring? And I think the reason as to why collective action theorists approach collective responsibility in a parallel way with individual responsibility is to meet Strawson's moral address condition. So Strawson argued that in order to be an appropriate target of reactive attitudes, individuals should have the potential to participate in interpersonal interactions. When an individual meets the moral address condition, they are part of the moral community, which means they are being regarded as a fully responsible moral agent, which means they qualify as being able to participate in interpersonal relationships, or in other words, they are the appropriate subjects of reactive attitudes. So altogether, I am skeptical as to whether collectives have to meet the moral address condition in the exact same way individuals do. And that's where I began to look into Virginia Held. So this entire time I've been talking about a collective agency and collective agents, and now I want to get into cases of non-agential collectives and interpersonal relationships. So I want to first briefly discuss a case that Held goes over, and I think from there I can then show how I extracted the certain conditions I think non-agential collectives need to meet in order to meet the moral address condition. Sorry, just a moment. So Held argues that there are special circumstances where a random non-agential collective can be held morally responsible for failing to perform an action. And her argument is when the action called for in a given situation is obvious to the reasonable person, and when the expected outcome of the action is clearly favorable, a random collection of individuals, a collective, may be held responsible for not taking a collective action. So what does that mean? What am I saying? There are two important conditions that I get from her argument. First, the action being called for must be obvious to a reasonable person. That is, if a reasonable person could see that it was not possible for the expected action to be performed, then it would be unreasonable to expect the non-agential collective to perform the action as well. The second condition is that the expected outcome of the expected action should be clearly favorable. So I think her case is important to explore because it sheds light on a situation where it would not be uncalled of for a society to have a negative reactive attitude towards a non-agential collective for its lack of performance. So here's one example that I really like that I call the non-performance case. So 7 normal, she uses the word normal, strangers are sitting apart in a subway car. In this case, the second smallest passenger, in full view and hearing of all the other passengers, attacks and begins to strangle the smallest person in the subway car. The remaining 5 passengers do nothing, even though they can hear and see what is occurring. According to Held, we will hold the strangers in the subway car morally responsible for failing to collectively stop the strangler, because it would be obvious to a reasonable person that the strangler ought to be stopped and that stopping the strangler would yield a favorable outcome. But if we bracket her reasoning as to how and why the non-agential collective can be held morally responsible, her work brings to light certain interesting features about interpersonal relationships between non-agential collectives and society. So, from the non-performance case, I located 3 main conditions surrounding a non-agential collective in these specific circumstances. And I believe that when this criteria is met, I'm able to justify and show how a non-agential collective meets the moral address condition, in other words, the non-agential collective qualifies as a member of the moral community. So this would then entail certain reactive attitudes towards the non-agential collective are justified in that the non-agential collective can have collective responsibility. And these conditions would be that the non-agential collective should be structured in such a way that it has the capacity to become a goal-oriented collective. The non-agential collective has to be in a situation or a specific location where a moral problem requires collective action. And the action being called into question, such as an expectation being placed onto the non-agential collective, is obvious to a reasonable person, and the expected outcome of the action is clearly favorable. So what does this look like with the non-performance case? Well, like I said, for the first condition, the non-agential collective should be able to become a goal-oriented collective. And let's say that these normal strangers are able bodies, they have an understanding of morality and are able to morally reason. So we can say that these 7 strangers have the capacity to become a goal-oriented collective, or in this case, a goal-oriented collective agent. For the second condition, we can say that for the non-performance case, all 5 remaining bystanders have to participate, or that the strangler is in such a way that it's going to require all 5 people to help. So maybe like 3 people trying to stop the strangler and 2 people calling 911. It just requires the specific location that the non-agential collective finds themselves in should require collective action. Because if it doesn't require collective action, then it just means an individual can take care of the problem by themselves. And lastly, stopping the strangler, as I had said, would create a favorable outcome, or it should at least. So, oh no, what to take away from this? So I think non-agential collectives, under certain circumstances, can genuinely meet the moral address condition and are a part of the moral community. I think this also means non-agential collectives that meet this criteria set can be the appropriate targets of reactive attitudes and therefore bearers of collective responsibility. And what I especially find interesting and want to look more into is that being a part of a non-agential collective does not automatically exempt you from your moral community. And lastly, we can discuss situations that are traditionally overlooked in the general literature on collective responsibility, or at least that was my overall goal. So that's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. I apologize again if I spoke really fast. Do I get out of sharing? But I'm excited for any questions, any pushback. I'm looking forward to it, to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Julisa. I don't think it was very fast, so we all.
Okay, great.
It was we were at the same pace with you. So we can now begin if there are questions. So I see, firstly, Hussein, I guess. Hussein, you can ask.
No, I think I'm trying to understand why you are considering failure to take action rather than like taking action. So when you're going, your examples are focusing on cases where the collective, non-agential collective, is failing to take an action, right? And I might have missed the reason that you specified, but I was just going to ask that.
That's a fantastic question, and I actually expand more on it in another paper. So it does look like I'm focusing a lot on failure to perform the action, and that's my fault, because what I'm interested in is the actual expectation for that non-agential collective to do something. So the kind of responsibility I'm actually interested in is forward-looking responsibility rather than backward-looking responsibility. But I'm also realizing that reactive attitudes aren't prima facie backward-looking, they're also forward-looking. So it seems strange to say, theoretically, that a non-agential collective can be morally blameworthy. That doesn't make sense because they're not a collective agent. But maybe there are certain negative reactive attitudes that we can have when you see a failure to perform, such as disappointments. So I think what we can get maybe from failure is sort of like an idea of what we expect, what we're hoping to see. But you know what, that was actually my fault, because I want to put more emphasis on the expectation to do something, that first condition. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you.
Simon, you're next, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I had a question which was about whether maybe some of the puzzle might be arising just from some of the terminology, I guess. Mm-hmm. So clearly in some cases where you have like a university or a corporation, you've got a distinctive mm-hmm. kind of collective agent there.
Yeah.
But it seemed, just as I was listening, it seemed perhaps not quite right to label a collection of agents non-agentive, right? Because they are a collection of agents, just in virtue of the individuals making up the collection. That's very different to a collection of inanimate objects, for example, where then you've clearly got a collective which is very distinctively non-agential. But in the case where you've got a collection, even if it's a random collection of agents, it just struck me that it's not obvious that it's a non-agential collective, and maybe just some of the categorizing that's going on, maybe some of the background assumptions might be adding to the puzzle. I'm not saying there isn't a puzzle, I'm just saying I wonder whether, you know, yeah, if you label a collective non-agential, then it's puzzling how they could be blameworthy. But maybe there's just a different type of collective, which is agential in a different way to a corporation or a university, and that might diffuse some of the puzzle.
That's fantastic. I've never thought of that before. Thank you. So I think maybe for some of the terminology, I can see how that helps fuel the puzzle. So when I'm referring to a collective agent, I'm referring to a group of people who have some kind of structure, organization, who are able, the collective itself is able to have a collective intention, a goal, a collective action, right? And a non-agential collective would be a group of people who lack that structure and organization. So one collective that I'm really interested in is the ethno-racial collective, the Latinx collective. And so even though there are similarities within that collective, and some people may say, no, there aren't. But let's just say that there are, right? That when I say Latinx collective, I am referring to a specific collection of people. That group is not unified enough to have a collective intention or collective goal in the way that we say a collective club does, or even two people carrying a table, if that makes sense, right? Because when two people carry a table, there's like that collective goal to, we're going to carry this table. So that's what I mean by the terminology, but I really do like how you said that maybe that non-agential collective agency is just of a different kind or a different type. And I think you're onto something there, because I think that that first condition is that this non-agential collective should have the capacity to form into a goal-oriented collective. So because they are agents, there is that capacity to become a collective agency. So for example, let's say that the bystanders on the subway car are all, the 5 remaining bystanders are infants. It wouldn't meet that first condition because those infants don't have the capacity to become goal-oriented. Right? We wouldn't want infants to try to stop a strangler. That would probably not yield favorable results or outcomes at all. So I really appreciate your question. I'm going to think more about it. That has me excited. Thank you.
Kathleen, you're next.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm curious about, as you continue to develop the project, I was curious about, thinking with you about what the role of sort of the reasonable person is going to be. Just thinking about, how people like Iris Marion Young and some other people, I can send you links if this ends up being interesting to you.
I would appreciate that.
Cool. Have sort of talked about how what the sort of Rawlsian reasonable person, or like what the reasonable person can do, is often theorized as, what a certain kind of like socially normative person would do, or a person who's in like a social majority group would do. And that can sometimes be a problem if the kind of very issue of reasonableness at hand is that, someone who's from an oppressed group or a minority group might say like, hey, what's reasonable to me is not the same as what's reasonable to you. And obviously we would expect diversity within that group as well. But I would love to hear your thoughts about how to sort of like work with the reasonable person standard in that context.
That's a great question. I have kind of been thinking about that as well, because I think that is a problem that I do have to address. Because what if for a particular person, what is reasonable is to continue to oppress a certain group of people, or what is perceived to be reasonable? And I honestly don't have an answer yet for that, like how to give a guideline as to what it is to be a morally reasonable person. So we have to get back to you on that. That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Sorry that I don't have a better answer.
No, I mean, I don't either, but I'll definitely send you some stuff about the kind of ideal theory, non-ideal theory debate where a lot of this is hashed out.
The ideal person. I would greatly appreciate that. That would help me.
Okay, Philip, I guess you may take the floor.
Thanks. So you mentioned that for agential collectives, the responsibility or accountability is not assigned to each and every individual. And I think that that's actually quite important, especially for the context you're working in, because it can really matter that it's not the individuals. For instance, if there's a ethnic group that demands reparations for a past genocide that happens 100 years ago or something like that, the state in question, it matters that the accountability is assigned to the state and not to the politicians and militaries who perpetrated the genocide. So, but in the case of non-agential collectives, it's not that clear if the accountability always stops at the level of the collective. At least in the case of the strangers, the people on the tram, it seems to me that each and every one of them would be held responsible. And so maybe that's just due to the example, but I have a hard time imagining cases of non-agential collectives where the accountability can be assigned on the level of the collective and not on the level of each and every individual. So
okay.
Yeah.
Got it. That's a great question. So I decided to go, or I believe that the best way to go is the non-distributive responsibility route for non-agential collectives. For the subway car, I think normally when we will look at like how the bystanders fail to do something, I was thinking about how as a society we normally say, well, they should have done something, that group should have done something. So when we're looking at distributive responsibility, I kind of thought of it as being, well, each individual, like, would that be each individual had 100% responsibility or accountability for not doing anything? Or would it only be 20% accountability since there are 5 of them? And that to me just seemed pretty unhelpful, because, you know, I want it to be more forward thinking of, well, something should have been done. Or we can use it as an example to say, when you see someone being strangled, like, and, you know, there's like a group and all the conditions are met, like, you should do something, or like the group should try to do something. And one example I can think of where there is, like, where we do see groups doing something is if there's a person drowning, right, during a flooding, and you see a group of people joining hands and working together to get this person out. I don't think we would morally praise, like, well, this person gets 5% moral praise because they were at the end, and this person gets like 97% moral praise. I'm not really sure how, if we were to go the distributive responsibility route, how we would attribute each percentage of responsibility. Does that make sense? So that's why I thought the non-distributive responsibility route would be more helpful and less confusing. And also, like, one case that I want to look at, let's think of the non-agential collective at a bigger scale rather than such a small one. For the Latinx collective, it seems kind of hard, maybe impossible to say that each individual has to do this much. Okay, so for a backstory, I'm interested in how the Latinx collective perpetrates and maintains anti-Blackness in the United States. So it would seem weird, or I'm not really sure how I could say that each member of this collective has to do this much to stop anti-Black racism in the US. I want to say that the Latinx collective as a whole has a responsibility, a forward-looking responsibility to stop maintaining and perpetuating anti-Black racism. That's sort of my bigger project. But I just wanted to give a smaller snippet of what I'm trying to say. Does that help? Do you have any other questions?
No. So the thing is, I think you are correct in saying that it doesn't make any sense to numerically distribute accountability or responsibility. It just seems to me that there's some kind of tension here.
Okay. Okay, no, thank you. I'll have to look more into that.
Okay, Hussein, you may go ahead.
I have a quick follow-up, I think. So your last remark on political actions, like Latinx group has a responsibility as a collective to prevent racist movements or racist tendencies, etc. So when I think of such a responsibility on the Latinx group, it seems like a very big responsibility, right? You have to have some organization, you have to like get together, you have to organize a collective action. Mm-hmm. And then I compare this to actions that a person can take, an individual can take. And in your examples of the subway car, you were mentioning that, that there should be a case in which the collective can only succeed and the individual cannot succeed. The collective is necessary and sufficient for success or for the action, and the individual is not sufficient for succeeding in the saving this strangled person, saving the victim in that example. So, but in political cases, individual action is not like, does not give a 0 or 1 result, right? So it's not like as a Latinx community, we can succeed, we can just work towards preventing racism, but individuals cannot do anything at all. It's not like that. There are all these gray areas in between.
Right.
So do you think there might be a tension between, I mean, this might be a follow-up question from Philip, there might be a tension between trying to organize and like take action collectively versus, okay, just let me get on the streets and do whatever I can as an individual or as a small group rather than trying to organize the whole Latinx community?
Okay, I think I follow your question. So I want to first say that my main goal, so in the literature, with what we have right now for the literature, I can't say the Latinx collective has that responsibility to like help stop anti-Black racism because it's not already a collective agent. But I want to say that this non-agential collection has that responsibility. And I feel that there are cases where we do apply collective responsibility to non-agential collectives, but the literature would say, no, that's just misdirected. So what I wanted to focus on and show was that, no, we can apply that responsibility to non-agential collectives. And that's what I hope I'm doing. Now, I think you're right about like how, like now that if I successfully show that the Latinx collective has this responsibility, how do we move forward with it, right? That's sort of your question, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Also, how would you reconcile with the possibility that individuals or even smaller groups can take action rather than trying to organize as a larger collective?
Right. So when I say that the entire collective has that responsibility, oh, see, now you got me thinking. Because I'm not sure if the entire collective as a whole has to become a collective agent. Now it does sound kind of non-distributive now that I think about it, because what would the percentage be of how many mini collective agents within that collective have to get together and start organizing? Okay, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that. I'm not sure how to go about that. That's a really good question. That has me stumped. That was great.
Thank you.
You got me
Thank you.
stumped there. I have to think about that.
Okay, nice to have such questions that give us a space to think, right? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands right now. If so, maybe we can end this session.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Melissa. And
Thank you everyone who asked awesome questions. I appreciate it so much.